My name is Tom Zutaut. I grew up near Chicago. I was born in Detroit. At 9 years old, I went to Chicago. I love records. Don't ever take me to a vinyl store because you'll lose me for 3 hours. But my passion for music ultimately got me a job at Elektra Records here in Los Angeles, and I ended up finding a band called Mötley Crüe when I was 18 and a half or 19 years old. Can't remember exactly, but and that sort of like changed the path of my career. I went from sales and marketing to finding bands and making records. And the thing about American Satan is that although it's a Faustian tale, or a tale of Faust, and a lot of people have covered the tale of Faust, but nobody's really covered it in the context of a rock band. And it's a lot more real than you might imagine. I lived it. I lived it with more than one band. I lived it with Mötley Crüe and Guns N' Roses and a few others. For the time that we're living in right now, this story, it's so authentic. It's a more modern exploration of this story, which is a part of the human experience. One of the great things about that movie is that the casting is fucking awesome. There's like Bobby, my favorite guy from Sons of Anarchy. There's, one of my favorite characters from Game of Thrones, Jon Snow's buddy. There's like the evil fucking guy, from Entourage that was Ari's boss before Ari took over the business. These people make it real because they do a great job at acting. I mean, it's like A-level acting to tell this story. Everyone should go see it, and some people might gawk at it in like, wow, that's really scary, or it might, they might think it's a horror film, and they might think it's complete fiction. Everyone will have their own experience, but it is something that is real in the human experience and in human dynamics, and I think the easiest way to tell the story is through rock and roll music. I've seen it happen, and I've seen darkness around people who have compromised themselves and been tormented by the good angel and the bad angel on their shoulders. The devil, Satan on one side, and angel on the other side. All people that come from nowhere, and suddenly, in a matter of moments, they're like working as a minimum wage clerk in Walmart to suddenly, they've got all these people worshiping them and putting them up on a pedestal. This story really gives you an idea of what it's like to be, somebody from the Midwest that all of a sudden is on the cover of every magazine and newspaper and website in the world and is in the news, and they're like, man, I'm just Johnny Faust from Ohio, I drove like a 20-year-old car and I'm nobody. And then all of a sudden, you're driving around in a Ferrari and all these people are running after you. There's a lot of fun. I'm not going to take away the fun that there is along these rides, but there's a lot of like emotional conflict and dilemma over a quick rise to success like that. And the compromises that sometimes it takes to get there, to get the machine to get behind you. I was the guy that signed Mötley Crüe and Guns N' Roses to their first record deals. I found a lot of people. I mean, I signed Dokken, Rockin' with Dokken, George Lynch, the Super Shredder. I signed a lot of people. I signed Enya. I mean, I'm just a totally different kind of music. People used to say to me, you'll never find another band or artist that sells more records than Guns N' Roses. And then Enya ended up, everybody wanted an Enya record in their house to play during a candlelight dinner. So, again, it's sort of like, think about the juxtaposition of light and dark, yin and yang. There's this dichotomy of energy, devil, angel, a gun and a rose, Guns N' Roses and Enya. Now, the story impacted me because I lived it. I think the easiest way to tell the story is through rock and roll music, because rock and roll music, even Elvis Presley was accused of being the devil's music in the late 50s when he came out. There is a scene in American Satan where a mother wants to give her teenage daughter her first sexual experience, with a rock star. And that might seem really far-fetched, and I'm not going to say which band it was, but I witnessed a mother give her teenage daughter to a rock band, and I sat outside the room where it happened, conflicted about whether to call the cops, whether to run away, or what to do. I think that, we're living in a world that is really politically correct in many ways, and I think there are a lot of good things about politically correctness, and, I don't think that, that any young woman or teenage girl, should have to deal with stuff that's going around them these days. I mean, not that it hasn't happened since men and women were created. It's really hard to define the Sunset Strip except to say that there were the riots on the Sunset Strip in the 60s. In fact, there's a film about it called Riot on Sunset Strip. In the early 80s, there was a really interesting juxtaposition of tribes of people. You had like the old sort of like Van Halen Gazzarri's crowd. Believe it or not, it was an older crowd, by the time the early 80s rolled around. You had the ex-Germs, Fear, LA punk crowd, the Go-Go's, X. There was that crowd. And then there was this like new rock crowd of kids that were into Mötley Crüe and Poison. The Sunset Strip in the early 80s, you had all these different tribes of people, and they were all really obsessed with what they were into. And so you'd have, Mötley Crüe at the Whiskey, you'd have X at the Roxy, you'd have Fear at the Troubadour, and then all these people would fight each other on Sunset Strip. The LA County Sheriffs would have to block it off. In the early 80s, Sunset Strip was sort of like a West Side Story, except there were like 4 gangs of tribes and gangs of people rather than just 2. As it evolved and, sort of like the Van Halen sort of things disappeared and, the punk scene, the Go-Go's became more pop and, and people started mixing more, when all the LA tribes kind of walked away from the Strip and it looked like the Strip was going to quiet down, then the Orange County people came up and they were like tourists. They wanted to go find out what all this energy was about. What were these people fighting about? Why is the street closed off? People wanted to be a part of the gangs. So it was very interesting, the Sunset Strip in the 80s. I mean, you got to imagine, for a while there was that Sunset Strip Music Festival where they blocked off Sunset and, there were, thousands of people there watching 3 or 4 different stages. Well, it used to be like that every Friday and Saturday night in the 80s. And then it kind of went away, but, there's still the Whiskey and the El Centro, which is now the Viper Room. You had, the Whiskey, the Roxy, the Rainbow, Gazzarri's, and then it was the Key Club. And then just down one block on Santa Monica, you had the Troubadour. So you had all these clubs, that were playing all these bands that people actually, wanted to see. But, by the mid-90s, it kind of faded away, and you had all, everything was pay to play, and you had all the bands fighting for the same 200 people to pay to play to see them. And now, the only place you can really get an authentic experience of what it was like, during the 80s when Sunset Strip had 10,000 people on it on a weekend and was blocked off is to just go to the Rainbow on a Friday or Saturday night when it's really crazy. But imagine, that what you might see on a Friday or Saturday night where there's a hot show at the Whiskey and the Rainbow and the Roxy next door, imagine the entire Sunset Strip from Doheny to the old Tower Records blocked off with that many people, scuffling in the street. And a lot of people don't know this, but they do shows upstairs, like a lot of starting out bands, Mario Maglieri, he used to put bands upstairs at the Rainbow where Johnny Faust ODs, right? They used to put bands up there. When nobody knew a band and they couldn't get a gig at the Roxy or the Whiskey or the Viper Room, Mario Maglieri, rest his soul, he would put these struggling kids upstairs at the Rainbow just to get a buzz going and get them started. Mario Maglieri was one of the, he single-handedly changed Sunset Strip. He took it from the 60s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s because he gave people a chance. Every time I would go to the Rainbow, he would say, "Hey kid, what's up? Do you got any new bands I can help out?" I mean, he's 80 years old and he's saying that. Are there any new bands I can help out? Just let me know. I'll put them in the Whiskey on an opener. Doesn't matter what the booker tells you. I'll get them on. No pay to play. They can play the Rainbow upstairs. This is a guy who, I met in 1980 who gave me a shot to get into his club. And, you know, the year he died, you know, a year or two ago, would still say, hey kid, you got any bands you need to start out? I'll help them, let me know. I mean, it wasn't like, hey, here's a 500 tickets, sell them at 10 bucks a piece. Like, he truly was an amazing person. And like me, he was from Chicago. We shared that sort of, there was this like Chicago bond kind of thing. There have been other movies that have sort of like looked at the yin and the yang of Faust and the devil and the angel on your shoulder. One that really comes to mind is Crossroads. Yeah, there was the Devil's Advocate. So there's been the Devil's Advocate and Crossroads, and probably others that I just don't remember, I'm not familiar with. It is something that is real. There are these opposing dynamics that the human experience seems to be drawn to. And at the end of the day, we make our choices in life based on those two things that are constantly tugging at us.